The aerodynamics of airplanes is fascinating. The problem is that we can't visualize it because the air is transparent. But around an airplane, things happen that you would never have imagined. Over all these years, on YouTube I've carried out a multitude of experiments to be able to visualize it and thus be able to show it to you. This is the definitive video. Why would you never want to land near a moving helicopter? How did the Spitfire fighters manage to shoot down planes without firing at them? Or why is the A380 a superplane? Is that what you're about to discover? A mistaken aviation theory states that planes fly due to the air passing through them. An airfoil profile must take the same amount of time to traverse this profile, whether it goes over the top or underneath. Since airfoil profiles have a curve on the top and therefore are longer, the air should speed up as it would cover a greater distance in the same amount of time. So by Bernoulli's principle, which relates the speed and pressure of a fluid, the pressure should decrease above the wing. And this pressure difference would be what generates the lift force. Well, this theory is emphatically false, and I've been trying to debunk it for years. This video won't explain lift generation, as I've covered it in several other videos. What we're going to do is explore the behavior of the air when it is affected by an airplane. What we do know for sure is that the pressure decreases on the top of an airplane wing and increases on the bottom. Low and high pressure areas come together at the tip of the airplane's wings. If we analyze the force that an air particle would feel that was just here having more pressure below than above, it would tend to rise, but when it rises a little, now what will happen is that it will have more pressure on the outside than inside, where the fuselage is, and therefore the particle tends to move inward. And that's when the vortex-shaped movement is generated, and we're really not talking about precisely small vortices. It turns out that these vortices can be seen on some occasions, for example, if certain conditions are met. Atmospheric conditions. It is possible that in the center of the vortex, where the pressure is lowest, a ring of condensation is generated and stays in the air for several seconds or even several minutes. Although we are only seeing the central part of the vortices, they are actually much larger. What happens is that condensation only occurs in the area where the temperature has dropped significantly, and that coincides with the center of the vortex. This resembles airplane contrails that we see in the sky. We already talked about this topic in this video that I leave on screen in case you're interested. Under other conditions where there are clouds involved, you can see how these are affected by airplanes when they pass by. And that's why we can appreciate the behavior of the air. But this only occurs under very special conditions of low altitude clouds. Since in these videos the planes are either taking off or landing. If you pay attention, you will see how the plane diverts air downwards and at the same time generates a vortex on each wing. These vortices keep spinning for a few seconds, but here comes the question, how big exactly will these vortices be? Well, it is known that the size will be determined by the wingspan of the plane. That is, a large plane will generate larger vortices than a small plane. Does it make sense if you think about it in the end? The vortex is generated by the air affected by the wing, so the larger the plane, the more air will be influenced by the wing. But the truth is that there are many other determining factors in this. For example, the lift coefficient. This is a value that represents how well an object flies. The lift coefficient, by its English name, is simplified with CL. So, an object that has a high CL will be something that generates a lot of lift. We can say that values above 0.2 are good, generating lift, while values close to 0 generate almost no lift. So, a wing that had a CL of 0 would not generate a pressure difference between the top and the bottom, and therefore there would be no lift. On the other hand, a wing with a CL of 1 would have a pressure difference between the bottom and the top. And therefore those vortices would appear, and this is the reason why wingtip vortices are directly related to a type of resistance called induced resistance. This type of resistance appears when lift is generated, and that's why it's called induced, because it's induced by the lift force itself. Well, all this talk to tell you that the more CL an airplane has, the greater the vortices will also be. The F-18 takeoff video shows intense vortices due to aerodynamic effects. Not only are they quite large, but also the air moves super fast. This is because the plane, right next to the camera, raises its nose. By doing this, the angle of attack is increased, and this increases the lift coefficient, and therefore, the intensity of the vortices is increased. Had the plane not raised its nose, it would have still generated strong vortices, but not as intense. For example, this is an F-16 making a low pass. You can see that the vortices it generates are also huge, and the plane is not increasing the angle of attack. Ever since I studied the career, I always heard that using a laser and smoke you can see the behavior of the air. So I decided to do this experiment in my own home with a smoke machine. On my secondary channel, I made a video that I leave at the end of this one about the process to set it up, because it's much harder than it may seem. For anyone who wants to try this at home, if you pay attention, you can clearly see the vortices, and also how the plane pushes the air downwards. In fact, the vortices are seen being dragged downwards. In a small committee, I'll tell you that this is really the reason why the plane flies. If it's pushing the air downwards, the air is going to exert that same force on the plane, but in the opposite direction, that is, keeping it flying. After trying several times, I tried various things, and one of them was to throw a plane with flaps and without flaps. This case is particularly interesting because both planes weigh exactly the same, they are exactly alike. The only difference is the lift coefficient. As mentioned earlier, the greater this value, the greater the intensity of the vortices, which is more or less visible in the videos. Something curious is that the plane that does not have flaps has to fly faster to be able to stay in the air. After repeated attempts, it is observed that a plane with flaps generally generates slightly larger vortices and, more notably, more downwash, pushing more air downwards. Another thing that occurred to me was to put one plane next to the other to increase the wingspan, and see how this affected the vortices. After this, I put one plane on top of the other, and so we could see the difference the vortices would have between the first case and this one. The experiment is very interesting because it's important to note that the weight is exactly the same in both cases. But really, their aerodynamic characteristics are completely different. You can see how the one with more wingspan flies much better. This is because the wing pushes the air down along the entire wingspan, meaning it affects much more air. But on the other hand, the two planes stacked on top of each other having less wingspan affect less air. To fly, it must push the air down harder, meaning it will need to fly with a greater angle of attack. Notice how the mass of air moving downward is much thinner, but you can see that it moves downward faster. In the other case, you can see that there is more mass of air, but it moves slower, and this, my friends, is much more efficient. And it's the key reason why planes like the U-2 or gliders that want to stay in the air for a long time have a very long wingspan. If we put it in slow motion, we can see how in reality the vortices start to generate once the plane has already passed. Generally in commercial planes, which are much larger than these that I was testing at home. It is said that the vortices are generated about 2 seconds after the plane passes. And the incredible thing about this is that the vortices can not only be seen, but they can also be heard. These videos are recorded next to runway 32R at Madrid Airport, where the planes pass extremely close, approximately about 100 meters high. As previously observed, the plane creates vortices that are pulled downward. And being so close to the plane, the vortex, which is actually air moving very fast, is what can be heard. Note that a plane flying with flaps will generate more intense vortices. For this reason, at the moment of landing is when these vortices will be at their highest intensity, because the planes go with all the flaps on. The most amazing thing to my surprise is that there are times when you can even feel these vortices. This is something very special. I've been to Madrid Airport many times to watch planes land, and almost never have I been able to feel them, but there have been times when I have. It's crazy. It's crazy. In the previous videos, you would have seen that there are a lot of people around. And a few weeks ago, I decided to have a meetup with subscribers to go to the airport to see if we could measure these vortices. Today, we are going to try to measure the vortices of the planes. Okay, can they be heard? We will definitely be able to hear that, and they can be felt.
He's over there. Another one is speaking over there. Look.
I had the idea to measure them by planting many sticks in the ground with cloths hanging from them, in such a way that we could see if when a plane passed, these cloths move faster. But the reality is that this day, no vortex was felt very clearly. I'm going to release a video on my secondary channel soon explaining why we weren't feeling the vortices. But pay attention to what I was able to experience a few months ago in that same place. In World War II, the Germans designed flying bombs that they would launch from the continent towards Great Britain. These were the V-1s. To defend against this, the British used their iconic Spitfire planes to shoot down these bombs before they could hit. The problem was that pilots sometimes ran out of ammunition before shooting them down, but as it was a top priority, they found another way to bring them down. They would align themselves parallel, wing to wing, to alter their trajectory and disrupt the gyroscope that guided them. The incredible thing is that it is even said that the Spitfires didn't even have to physically touch the wings of the V1S. That the vortex they generated was large enough to make them lose their course and crash. This design is from my clothing brand, Air Vortices. To celebrate, I'll include the link in the description if you'd like to check it out. On January 17th, 2017, an Airbus A380 was the protagonist of an unlikely event. A small Bombardier Challenger plane, commonly known as a private jet, would take off from the Maldives to go to Al Bateen in the United Arab Emirates. In parallel with this, an Airbus A380 would take off from Dubai to go to Sydney. Several hours into their flights, the two planes were about to cross paths over the ocean. It's important to note that the Bombardier Challenger was the plane that would pass underneath, and the separation between the two aircraft would be about 1,000 feet, which is equivalent to 300 meters. This is the closest distance two planes can be when they are crossing in mid-air. 300 meters is really very little. Both planes could see each other perfectly. Everything was normal until, about a minute after crossing, the Bombardier began to shake and suddenly turned sharply to the left, generating a roll movement. The G-forces first increased to 1.6 G-forces and then decreased to minus 3.2 Gs. Everything inside the plane was thrown towards the ceiling. The pilots had their seatbelts on. The abrupt turn caused some of the plane's inertial systems to malfunction. Fortunately, the pilots managed to get the aircraft out of that chaos, but they lost more than 8,000 feet of altitude in the process. That is, about 2.5 kilometers. The aircraft ultimately made an emergency landing, despite numerous issues resulting from the situation. On that day, the Challenger flew directly into one of the Airbus A380's whirlwinds. Those whirlwinds were already big enough for the plane to enter one of them, and that's why he felt a tremendous force that made him spin. Because of this reason, there must be safety distances and times between each aircraft at airports. Not only is it important how big the plane that is landing is, but you also have to consider the size of the plane that is going to go right behind. This table summarizes all the necessary considerations. First, we look at which plane will land first, and then which plane will land next. As seen in the category, there are only 4 types: light, medium, heavy, and super heavy aircraft. In this last category, there are only the A380 and the Antonov 225, but the latter was destroyed when the war in Ukraine began. Therefore, as of today, we would only have the A380. To give you an idea, large planes, the transoceanic ones, would be in the category of heavy aircraft. Commercial planes like the Boeing 458 miles, AX or Airbus A320 are considered medium-sized aircraft. And the light aircraft category is for planes the size of private jets or even smaller. So if an Airbus A380 were to land, and right after a Boeing 787 were to land, the time between them would have to be at least 3 minutes, but if you look here on the side, for the moment of takeoff, the minimum time is 2 minutes. This is because, as we have explained, the vortices are at their maximum size at the moment of landing. During takeoff, planes have reduced flap configuration, resulting in smaller vortices generated. This video didn't mention helicopters, but when close to the ground, they create large vortices in all directions, similar to airplanes. The air is pushed down by the helicopter's rotor, it hits the ground and moves to the sides, as it also rises, and that's what generates the vortices. Sometimes a plane has gone to land a few seconds after a helicopter and things have not ended very well. Just like in the previous case with the planes, here we also have to take into account the size and weight of the helicopter and the aircraft that comes after. If the helicopter is heavy but the aircraft coming behind is light, the air could move it, and being close to the ground, it would not have a margin for correction and could crash. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you want to learn more about aerospace engineering, remember that my book explains the physical fundamentals in a way that doesn't require an engineering background, which is the book's purpose.